Kia ora koutou and welcome. My name is Marek Tesar and I'm currently chairing the RECE steering committee, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the very first Reconceptualizing Early Child Education RECE webinar. I would like to acknowledge all the Indigenous people and traditional owners on whose land we are connecting today to this webinar. I want to also acknowledge all teachers, families and children who were affected by the pandemic. And I also want to acknowledge our colleagues in Bethlehem in Palestine, who were working so hard on this year's conference, ready to welcome our RECE community, just to find themselves in the midst of pandemic and the conference canceled. I understand that today we have almost 300 people from over 25 countries with us today. And some of you may be new to RECE, and Mimi Block has reminded me that something needs to be said to welcome you to this wonderful special organization with such a rich history. Please go to our website, receinternational.org, to find out about rich history and the activities of RECE. But there is something to be said about critical approach to early child education and childhood studies. In particular, I think the following statement on RECE's website positions the organization's clear direction. We share a concern about privileging particular sets of beliefs or forms of knowledge or grand narratives that typically reflect Western or Eurocentric values, which can create power for certain groups of people and oppress others. RECE has been for some time governed by the RECE Steering Committee, which consists of prior conference chairs, representative of the RECE elders, and a treasurer. The current steering committee members are Mimi Block, Thomas Ellegaard, Janice Kroger, Colette Murray, Jonathan Sillin, Beth Blue-Swardener, Matthias Urban, and I'm currently chairing it. In 2020, we have met so far 25 times. And as part of these meetings, we have resolved, sadly, to cancel our annual conference, making sure that our organization thrives and will continue to do so well into the future and organize RECE's finances. We will be reporting back to RECE members early next year during our business meeting about our progress. Most importantly, however, we have spearheaded the development of the RECE Charter, which will guide RECE organization. After the webinar today, we will be releasing the draft version of the charter, which will be open for consultation from RECE members. Finally, I want to thank you on behalf of the RECE Steering Committee and all of us, the Webinar Planning Committee, who have done an amazing job organizing this webinar and the wonderful lineup of speakers here today. The webinar committee was Mimi Block, Thomas Ellegaard, Janice Kroger, Mark Nagasawa, Lacey Peters, Beth Blue-Swardener, and the Bank Street College of Education, who provided all the technological and graphic design support. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Jana Gobel, our MC and tech wizard from Arizona State University, who was working hard in the background to make this webinar functional and operational. Enjoy today's special event. Ngā mihi nui, and until we can all meet together again in person, take care in these strange times. And I will now hand over to Dr. Mark Nagasawa from Bank Street College of Education, who will chair our first panel. Mark?
Thank you, Mark. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for attending. I'm going to be very, very brief. The experts that we have on our two panels are really going to set the stage for the conversations that we're going to have later in the event. And so I want to make sure to acknowledge that because of our limited time, they are going to be active participants in the conversations. And so if you have interest in learning more about what they have to say, you can connect with them there and hopefully beyond this event. I think with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to our first panelist, Sonia Arndt from, I'm just going to let her introduce herself. Thank you.
And thank you to Mark for that wonderful welcome. And I just want to echo the acknowledgement of the lands that we're all working on as well. And I'm here in Melbourne now. My name's Sonia Arndt from the University of Melbourne. formerly from New Zealand, so I'm kind of still feeling like I'm straddling. But today I'm going to share you something about the Australian context and the ways in which the early childhood sector here has been served by the policy response to COVID. The policy responses to COVID have highlighted the value and contribution that early childhood education makes to society more in 2020 than ever before. They've highlighted that all the industries on which jobs and livelihoods depend on early childhood services being agile enough to adjust quickly to unknown demands and requirements. And they've raised professional precarities along the way. Tensions and inequities have come up in the early childhood sector for teachers, children, and for families. Those precarities have played out in Australia, or continue to play out differently in the 8 states and territories, as COVID itself has played out differently, with different populations and different vulnerabilities. The federal government implemented measures quite early on in Australia in the first wave of the pandemic, with the specific aim of keeping parents in work by providing care for their children. These measures at that time included, from March already, announcing a free childcare policy for essential workers and children who are vulnerable, a relief package to support centres to stay open. 3 of the states offered free childcare for 6 months to keep their economies going. There was a transition policy that came in after the relief package ran out. But all of these policy responses were also affected by the working from home orders, which also came in quite early. So the states and territories all made their own decisions about this, and affected early childhood services very differently in terms, for example, of attendance, of abilities to pay fees, and of how the families and the teachers were affected by other government initiatives like a job keeper payment, which was intended to keep workers associated with their workplace if there was no work. On a government level in Victoria, we entered our second wave in early August, where we had between 700 and 800 daily cases, and that was the record for Australia for daily cases. Victoria announced a hard lockdown and a state of disaster at that time. So all Victorians but essential workers were to work from home. The essential workers included the early childhood teachers who needed to be at work to look after, to mind the children of permitted workers and children who were considered vulnerable. Apart from that, from August to October, all early childhood settings were closed. Most recently, there's been a recovery package announced to support centres and families, and the Victorian government very recently has announced that there's going to be free kindergarten and long daycare for all of 2021. So the precarities for the teachers, just briefly, because I know we can talk some more about this, that it's raised, are on the one hand that teachers have felt more recognised more widely in their communities, but at the same time still reveal the underlying tensions that are speak to the fact that they're more recognised, but they're recognised as childminders rather than as the teachers that they are, that their jobs are still insecure, they're feeling vulnerable about that, that the policy responses have raised and brought to the fore the disadvantage that is already in the community, who is essential, for example, who is connected, who's not, and the funding stabilities and instabilities. Just as an example, the job keeper payment, which they originally were entitled to, was removed first of all from early childhood teachers and not from other workers. So there are still tensions out there that teachers are grappling with ways to stay connected with the children and the families while the centres are closed, that teachers have their own children at home and their own precarious teaching commitments. Those who were in centres were placed in the frontline positions as essential and therefore exposed. And now there's this ongoing question of not knowing whether they will still have a job, because the work from home we're slowly returning to work, but the work from home orders are still in place. So last but not least, the mental health issues that are arising from some of these questions and tensions remain. So I think I'll leave it there because we can carry on with some of the other points.
Thank you, Dr. Arndt. I appreciate your remarks and your expertise. And next, we're going to turn to Dr. Nkidi Phatudi from the University of South Africa. And I will turn it over to her.
Good evening. Thank you, Mark. And also, let me also thank the leadership of RECE for having invited me to this webinar. Let me start first by giving you the background of South Africa, where it came, where it comes from, and also at the onset also of COVID-19. We all understand that COVID-19 started in China and then it moved over to Europe. And by the time, the country was already aware that there is a virus that is coming on its way. So the only place that they could learn about from the COVID-19 was from Europe and also was from China. And at that time, very little was known about the virus itself, even how to mitigate it, because the virus had never existed before. And I believe that the first reaction of the government to the virus was to mitigate its effect on the population and not a sector thereof. Now, when I got this topic to talk about how well is ECD served by the policy response to COVID-19, I read this a number of times and I reflected on this a number of times before finally identifying how policy response to COVID-19 also served ECD. Now, when COVID-19 made its way into the country, obviously the first reaction was for the government to mitigate its effect on the population and not a sector thereof. The lessons those also that they learned from Europe and China too were not very helpful, as death kept on rising without any signs of subsidizing, of abating. As South Africa had early response to COVID-19, and this was loaded both by national and international countries. South Africa, I think it was the first country to go out and test people so that they could be quarantined to lessen the infection rates. But we know that even with this measure, this did not stop the virus from ravaging and spreading. But however, the message was sent out to the people about the dangers of the virus. Mitigating the COVID-19, lockdown also became the order of the day. And also as the economy was brought also to its halt. Only emergent sectors were allowed to get on with their duties. And ECD too was not spared. It also closed down together with the rest of the economy. It was only the emergency sectors that were allowed to go on. Now, closing down ECD, it meant a number of things, especially for a country like South Africa, where there is very vast inequality. We have a very strong first world economy. We have the second world economy. We also have the third world economy. And the third world is the largest of all the other two economies. With lockdown, it meant that children had to stay at home with their parents. Children who went to preschools, children who went to ECD centers. It meant that the meals that were served to them at preschools had to be stopped immediately. And it meant that they had to stay at home without those nutritious meals. What at the beginning was thought to be a 3 months lockdown it evolved into months and into months. And children were locked at home without going out into the ECD centers. Now, besides this again, the government also came up with a number of the relief measures, which were not necessarily targeting ECD, but they were targeting the whole of the population of the country. They came up with relief measures such as the Unemployment Insurance Fund, which for you to register for it, you have to pay every month to the Department of Labor. And when you go out on either you are being retrenched at work, then you can claim that UIF on monthly basis. Now, unfortunately, it's only about 35% of the ECD workforce which is registered for UIF, which meant that 65% did not qualify for this kind of a government relief. There is also another relief measures which the government came up with, which is called the tax rebates. Those people who pay their taxes to the South African Revenue Services, they also benefited from the tax rebates. But it is only about 45% of ECD in the country, which is registered with SARS, meaning that 55% is not registered and could not benefit from these tax rebates. The government came up with a special COVID-19 social relief of distress grant, seeing that people now were losing jobs, people now were out of jobs, including also the ECD sector. Most of them, they were also out of jobs because some of them, they rely on the fees that the parents pay on monthly basis. Now, with the parents not paying any fees, it meant that even the personnel of the ECD did not receive any salaries. The government came up with the social COVID-19 relief, which all the people who were unemployed could claim about 350 rand, which is an equivalent of about $21 per month for 6 months. And this also included also the ECD workers who did not benefit from the UIF and also who did not also benefit also from the tax rebates. Child grant of 445 rands per child was given to those families who earned below the sub-minimum of about 200,000 rands per month. And these parents also benefited from them and made sure that those children who did not go to preschools also benefited from the grant. Subsidized ECD centers, they continued to enjoy the subsidy from the government of 15 rands per child per day. But we know that there are those other ECD centers who did not qualify to get the subsidies. Those ones were left to their own devices. And these ECD centers, they are in the majority. Most of them, they are rural and they are Black and they are also disadvantaged. However, NGOs, religious formations, foundations, and also the government, the Department of Social Development, also responded also to this rise in the levels of hunger that the ECD people and also the rest of the country were going under. They delivered food parcels to the people, but also we know that this also could not be maintained. And also learning materials were shared on social media and on the television. However, those ones who did not have the television or those ones who could not even access these learning materials on their cell phones, it means that they were left out. Now, I want also to talk about the unintended consequences of the mitigation of this COVID-19 on the ECD sector. these were not some things that really the government thought they were going to come, to the fore. But these are some of the effects that those mitigation of the COVID-19, came to the fore. One of them is the loss of human capital potential. Children being outside the preschools, children being outside, without getting any stimulation from preschools or from the teachers there. The gains also that were made, between January and March before the lockdown were lost. And those children who could not even access any of the materials from the television or even from their cell phones, it means that they were just left to their own devices. Loss of also income by the teachers. Teachers also, because salaries were not paid, therefore the teachers also were left without any income. Loss of also income by the ECD centers. No payment of fees was made there. It was only the independent preschools, those ones who did not get any subsidy from the government, those ones who served the affluent societies of the country. Those were the ones who survived really through this COVID-19.
Thank you very much.
Because they were home, they were also entangled also in the domestic violence. Lots of domestic violence were seen throughout the lockdown, more than any other time, before COVID-19. So most of the children also were affected by this lockdown. However, besides these negative or unintended consequences, there were also gains made by the ECD Center. When the ECD centers were had to open, they had to follow the COVID-19 protocol. And ECD centers and also schools in the rural areas, most of them, they had some infrastructure issues. So the government had to go in there and make sure that the infrastructure was made, to be on a good level so that the children could go back again to school, because keeping them at home also, it did not benefit them in any way. The infrastructure, the government also started also to supply water. The government also supported children also. They brought in also the psychosocial support. They brought in also social workers also into the schools, to assist the children also in settling into the schools. So it was not all gloom in as far as ECD centers sector were concerned, but also there was also some good also that came also out of the COVID-19. The public itself coming out to come and assist the children, bringing in also some materials for the children to be kept busy during the holidays, flighting programs also on television. And those were some of the things that kept, the ECD sector going, during this doom period of COVID-19. I think I'm going to end there with the brief, with the country's response on early childhood on COVID-19. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Phatudi. Obviously, the consequences of this pandemic have been extremely severe and have reinforced many social inequities. I want to next turn to Dr. Mera Skerrett from the University of Wellington, who will share a little bit about conditions in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I do want to let folks know that we do have a second panel of experts that we really do want to make sure that we have time for so that we can have some of the rich discussion from all the participants later. And again, I apologize for how little time there is for this part of the program.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Mark. Ngā mihi nui rawa ki kōrua. I tēnei wā. And an honour, lovely to see all the familiar faces, and an honour to be a part of this gathering. And I must say, I certainly enjoyed the Back to Nature postings. But getting to the issue of the day, and I want to raise a few, after an initial overview of the national policies, I want to draw on some Indigenous experiences and perspectives. So in terms of national policy, it's spot in the final early learning services response to COVID, given by our Ministry of Education in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the general principles were at the 4 alert levels. Level 1, which we are now in, pretty much being wash your hands. And level 4 being total shutdown, everything closed. So they were the 2 levels at the extreme ends, but it was the levels 2 and 3 in the middle that I found most interesting and hugely controversial. Level 2 stated, early learning centres able to cooperate with most of their role, but may be restricted by space and size and those sorts of requirements. It was fairly nebulous, most of their role and may be restricted. But it's the level 3 that is most interesting in my view, because what it stated, the official directive was, quote, early learning centres will be open if there is a parent or caregiver available to look after children at home, stay at home. But here's the interesting telling statement: children will not be able to attend play centres or play groups. So early learning centres will be open, but children will not be able to attend play centres and play groups. So I found that interesting as a national policy response for 3 reasons. First, the differentiation between early learning centres on the one hand and play centres and play groups on the other. Secondly, who were the children likely to be attending either type of provision? And thirdly, the positioning of kohanga reo, which are the Māori language nests, totally invisibilised from the official response. And that actually resulted in a number of inequitable outcomes. On a cursory analysis, firstly, the early learning centres are the state-sanctioned, state-funded, privileged part of the early childhood sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where early learning happens. So they're to be left open, and the corollary is that the play centres or play groups are just that, at play, and by implication, not much learning going on, so they are shut down. So one, how equitable is that? Secondly, many early learning centres are expensive, largely privatised now in this country. They are generally monolingual, English-speaking centres, which, in spite of Te Whāriki, touted as being one of the world's first bicultural, bilingual curriculum documents, nearly a quarter of a century of living with Te Whāriki, not much has changed in early learning centres in terms of being able to communicate pedagogically through and in Te Reo Māori, which is the official language of this land. So the linguist colonial endeavour persists. Thirdly, kohanga reo are not actually mentioned in all the official documentation. So in terms of its positioning in a national response, it was not positioned. The Kohanga Reo National Trust eventually put out its own response to shut down and remain shut until further notice, in spite of what the official national response was. But during the national official response, it meant that in terms of the allocation of resource from the Ministry of Education, like tablets, books, etc., to assist with ongoing learning and teaching during levels 3 and 4, there was much upset at the inequitable resource allocations. Many kohanga reo and kohanga reo children, that's the Indigenous Māori children going to kohanga, got nothing. The group that should have been targeted for resource went invisible. There was a variety of reasons for that, but I don't have time to go into those here today. But in the latest piece of research put out by the Children's Commissioner just last week, titled Life in Lockdown, it stated, quote, responses to COVID-19 need to take into account the inequities that existed before the pandemic, those that have been exacerbated by COVID-19, and those that are forecast for the future. And further, at page 44, it says that this is the Ministry of Health's COVID response. The psychosocial response to COVID-19 must be grounded in equity and ensure responsiveness for Māori and for other population groups who experience inequitable outcomes or have unique needs, whilst also meeting the needs of the entire population. And we resonate with the former speakers in terms of that aspect. So from Indigenous perspectives, I remember there was much lively debate with two major issues during the level 4 lockdown. It got us all up in arms. One was raised by Rawiri Waititi, now a Māori Party elected member of Parliament, and we just had an election recently. He talked about the injustice and sheer stupidity of the directive around fishing and hunting, typically an Indigenous activity, but there was to be none. His argument was, well, how else are we going to feed our whānau or our families? Many of us living in the remote rural areas of New Zealand simply do not have access to a local supermarket. This is our livelihood and short-sighted of the government to try and disrupt what we've been doing forever. Secondly, there was the huge debate around increased surveillance, especially of our marae and tangihanga. These, our marae are Māori spaces. They're equivalent to the longhouses of the Indigenous people on Turtle Island, and tangihanga are the ways in which we send off our ones who have passed on. But where there was an increased police presence focused on our marae, as if COVID-19 somehow came out of there, I argued the focus should always remain on the border. The marae debate was simply an act of racism and the enactment of patriarchal colonial power, because Indigenous peoples are still thought of as immature, unable to handle ourselves somehow. But in the final analysis, we Māori, as the Indigenous people of this space, are used to working with trauma and have very sophisticated relational responses. So we can handle our marae just fine. But drawing on what Professor Linda Smith, the author of Decolonising Methodologies, has talked about recently in Not Our Apocalypse, is what she titled it, Not Our Apocalypse. She discussed an interesting aspect of COVID in terms of the concern many Indigenous peoples have at the rhetoric and the discourse. There being a lot of fear and anxiety in our communities during COVID, with the sense that Indigenous peoples would be hit hard, etc., and we need looking after, weirdly. But the reality is COVID-19 helped to resurface our embodied memories of intergenerational trauma, memories of loss, population decline. Previous epidemics played a role, and also war, colonial wars, and think of decline in terms of birth rates as well, traumatized, not giving birth to new populations, that all these are worth remembering. Perhaps that is the greatest apocalyptic moment for us then, is colonialism rather than what we are experiencing at the moment. After all, the colonial discourse was to, quote, smooth the pillow of a dying race. That was the discourse, very common discourse. And, many people still hold firm to that discourse that we actually all died out. We're always meant to be dying, but, perhaps that was just some wishful thinking there. But to sum up, a one-size-fits-all universalist colonial approach to policy development is always going to be precarious for Indigenous peoples, and to use COVID covertly to covertly entrench colonial state power, extremely problematic. But we're still here. We continue to provide the much needed critical and analytical tools in this country. We are the mōrehu, nō reira nei rā te mihi atu ki a koutou, mō a koutou taringa whakarongo. Kia ora rā.
Thank you, Dr. Skerrett. Next, we're going to turn to Dr. Matthias Urban from Durban City University.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Matthias Urban. I'm Professor of Early Childhood Education at Dublin City University, and I'm speaking to you at 8:30 in the evening from Dublin, not from Durban, but that's sort of just another part of the world. I would like to make a few observations connecting some of the Irish experiences during COVID-19 with some of what we've learned in our international collaborations, because I think there is a lot of learning for our discussion. First of all, I suppose What happened here in Ireland is that, like many countries, Ireland had to learn very quickly and had to learn the hard way that early child education is actually a common good and is an essential public service and an essential infrastructure. The collapse of which had severe implications, not just for children and families, but for the entire society. You can imagine that a discussion immediately sort of came into the public realm, talking about the importance of childcare for parents to be able to continue to work, the importance of childcare for so-called frontline workers, which at the beginning was really sort of a term for people working in the health sector, but soon got extended to people working in the retail sector and others. So there was an immediate sort of realization there is an essential public infrastructure. If we lose that, it has consequences. Another sort of realization was, and I think Ireland is very much in line with a number of other countries in the so-called Anglosphere, and then Mary just related to the privatization of early learning centers. Ireland relies for its early childhood sector on a highly unsustainable model of hands-off policies, chronic underfunding, and largely for-profit provision, private provision, that has collapsed. It has resulted in the collapse of the system, and it has severe consequences for children, families, educators, society, as I said. And for quite some time, we had this discussion whether or not early childhood services would actually be able to reopen past pandemic, because their business model has basically broken away, which led in Ireland, and I think there are similarities to other countries as well, to, and I quote, unquote, unprecedented state intervention. I think unprecedented has to be the word of the year, 2020. So all of a sudden, state intervention on a large scale into a private for-profit sector became possible and necessary. And it actually showed what is possible if necessity arises. So in practical terms, for a short while during the height of the pandemic, early child education and care in this country was practically nationalized. All the costs were basically taken over by the state, which leads me to think that there is a positive note in this, that the pandemic has actually opened a window of opportunity for fundamental system change, because for the first time there is this notion of a universal and public early childhood system, and it has entered the policy and public discourse. Just, and I'm aware of the time, just to briefly link this to some of the lessons from the international context, what we see when we look beyond Ireland is that on a positive side, increasingly early childhood education and care is recognized as key for social cohesion during crisis. We have statements, for instance, from the G20 naming early child education alongside healthcare and social welfare systems as the three fundamental pillars for societies to cope with crisis. We have seen some countries in the global south developing much more effective coping mechanisms and strategies, and we urgently need to learn with them and from them. Just to give one example, Colombia has rolled out a national strategy called Estrategia Contacto Sin Contacto, which enabled them, because of their integrated policy framework, to move supports from center-based to mobile technology much more easily than as possible here. But problematic on the other side, and I think this is my last point, while we have international organizations now recognizing or talking about early childhood as an essential element of public infrastructure, we also see sort of a counter movement. We can see from the World Bank, for instance, a discourse coming at the moment that says we recognize the importance of the private participation of the private sector in early child education and care. We recognize it has collapsed, but the World Bank then sort of goes on to say, in order to deal with that, we are not supporting the empowerment of governments to build sustainable, universal and public systems, but they're urging governments to basically bail out the private sector in order to prevent it from collapsing. And I think this again leads then into the whole arena of pressure on professionals, pressure on professionalization, increased pressure to deprofessionalize what we're doing with children, families, and communities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Urban. Our last speaker for the first panel is Dr. Marcy Whitebook from the University of California at Berkeley.
Good evening, good afternoon, good late morning to everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Marcy Whitebook, the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment. I'm Director Emerita at the center, which is focused on specifically on the pay and training and support for early educators. And I think that many of the things that have been said, I think if you want to look at a place that has completely failed in terms of the response to COVID, and has really been an abject failure in protecting people's health and livelihood and deepening pre-existing inequities in society, and creating terrible political division. You don't have to look much further than the United States. And I'm sure people are aware of what we've been going through politically over the last several months with the US election, which is continuing to be a struggle. And that has affected the response to COVID because there has been resistance all along to how to protect people and what kinds of relief policies and what public safety measures should be happening. So even when we're having over, 100,000, whatever the latest figure cases a day, people are still debating wearing masks. So, but with regard to early childhood, I think that while there has been, as Matthias and everybody has been saying, this recognition of how essential the sector is, and even there's been sort of this reluctant designation of early educators, childcare workers as essential. In fact, the policies have not been aligned with that. So there have been public health guidelines, which have ranged from the absurd to sensible, but with no support necessarily to implement those. Our favorite was telling people to help 3- and 4-year-olds social distance by giving them a piece of yarn that was 6 feet long and to put it around themselves when they were playing. So, and people, people could laugh about it, but actually just, people running programs are just bewildered by that. And then the relief policies at the national level, there was some unemployment support, some grants for businesses, but most of those things were very hard to access for people in the early childhood sector, except for the larger, more corporate or nonprofit, bigger programs. And you also had the situation where many of these supports ran out. So, and state policies were variable. And we had a very strong division between what we did with schools and what we did with early childhood. So as K-12 schools closed last March and then transitioned to distance learning or a hybrid of online and in-person instruction, nearly all the states kept their childcare centers open almost the entire time. A few restricted childcare to the children of essential workers, but generally childcare centers are open. And they are open because mostly programs felt like they couldn't afford to close, although many have, but they were operating at reduced capacity with fewer families and greater expenses. But I think the gap between what we saw happen with schools and happen with early childhood, as one teacher said, it hurt her soul because there was this notion that it was safe. It was not safe for teachers of older children to be it would be, to be working with children at great, cost to children and families. And it was okay for childcare centers and childcare workers to be working. And I think that right there you see this disparity, because the early care and education workforce is much more likely to be women of color, Black and Latinx in particular, but people from all different backgrounds. And it's a workforce that is living at a much greater rate of poverty than K through 12 teachers. So I think that I want to get to discussion. So I guess the thing that I just am going to say is that even if programs stayed open, it meant that the people working in them were under tremendous pressure, because they had to put into place all these public health measures. They had, and people were spending many hours cleaning, or if they were able to do something remotely, there were many teachers who said, I don't know how to do this. They did not have the level of technological support and other things that the public schools had. They were not getting help with fixing their buildings and making them safe for people. And these workers tended not to have health insurance, not to have any kind of paid sick leave, and not to be guaranteed that there would be some kind of testing and paid leave time if they had to, if the program had to close, or if they themselves got ill. And so this workforce is much more, that was the reality for early childhood teachers. So while I was worried about getting sick and worried about their own health and their own children and childcare, these workers were literally saying things like, I have to write my will now because I'm going to go back in and work with children. And many of the childcare workers are working in, living in communities that are predominantly predominantly Black, Latinx, and Indigenous and other people of color. Many people are undocumented, so there were fears about their immigration status. In addition to their people's housing conditions and exposure to illness were far greater, and that's why we see in the US much higher death rates in those communities than in other communities. So I think, to sum it up, because I really do want us to move forward, I guess I want to just say that what is so striking about this is that there was a lot of pressure put on the early childhood sector to step in and to become the care for the schools. And while the school community, the K through 12 community, basically was quite offended when they were thought of as childcare, they had no problem of asking the early childhood community to step in and do the care. And there was a reluctance to see the early educators as educators. And a couple of other things, this hit our home-based childcare programs, which are what we call family childcare. I think there are different names in different parts of the country, was terribly hurt because those programs had to stay open because that's people were living in their place of work, and that was how they could hold on to their homes. And so I think the other thing to just take into account, I hope we'll get into this in the second half, is that it's no accident that the early childhood community is not organized. For the most part, they do not belong to unions. So there's no organized voice. And that's been really, there's a lot of talk about that now, and there's different efforts emerging, but I think that it's no accident that there was no union, there were no people basically arguing for them. And all the early childhood advocacy community rallied for federal funding and federal funding. In fact, the concern there was more about the businesses and the people doing the work. And I think that to Matthias's point, I think there is this danger now as we think about reform. Is that reform going to be a further privatization, or is when in fact what we need to do is make this a public good? And just the last thing I would say is that the pre-existing disparities in the early childhood community were just totally reinforced by the response, because in most places, the only programs that continued to get their funding were our publicly funded preschools and Head Start programs, and our private programs, which are like 3/4 of the provision of early childhood, did not get that guarantee. And those public programs are the programs where people are more likely to have benefits and receive higher pay, and the private programs are where you see much more of the pay penalties for taking care of younger children and the racial disparities, racial pay parity and pay penalties. So I want to just move us on to the discussion, but I do hope that we'll talk more about, you know, how do we deal with this issue of, can we make this a moment where we move to more public systems? What are the threats against that? I think as programs are crumbling, we see that the corporate sector is much more likely to step up and be able to rebuild. And I think this, the organizing question and the continued question about valuing care. So we may be calling people essential workers, but we're certainly not treating them in any way as if they're essential. And that's longstanding and historic. And I think in the wake of the racial reckoning that's been going on in our country and around the world, I think that's given us another opportunity to really be talking about how the inequities that are in our given systems and how the proposals for reform, which we, you know, are on the, if we ever can get the new administration in, there are proposals for reform in the United States, but frankly, in my opinion, don't go far enough to really deal with those inequities, particularly the racial inequities that are built into our system for families and children and for the workforce itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Whitebook. And our second panel is really going to begin picking up where you left off around this issue of collective action and mobilization.
My name is Lacey Peters, and I'm moderating the second panel. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to provide some initial commentary, or just to help frame the conversation. I had a few words that I wanted to share. And then we will get right to it, just like Mark had mentioned. We have a lot to say and a little bit of time. So hello and thank you to everyone for being here today and for working towards more just, equitable, and anti-racist systems of early learning in your respective countries and as an international community. The presenters, as we know in the first panel, provided us with perspective on different countries' policy responses to the pandemic. And now we're going to turn our attention to how practitioners or policy enactors within the early childhood sector, including teachers, directors, advisors, and consultants, advocate for the field. The presenters of this panel will share with you ways that their interactions and experiences with policymakers, government agencies, regulatory bodies, among other entities, has helped or hindered their community engagement. The focus questions for this panel are: how has COVID affected your work, and how have you adapted your practices? What forms of activism have you engaged, and how are you adapting? The 5 presenters will be talking to you about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has impacted their daily lived experiences or those of their community members. And additionally, we're going to hear about the extent to which the ever-changing health and human services initiatives aimed at quote unquote flattening the curve and an emphasis on economic recovery has affected them directly, to how it has altered their relationships with policymakers and has shifted their advocacy efforts to focus on more rapid responses to the issues that have influenced over their efforts to nurture the well-being of teachers, their colleagues, care providers, children and families, and other community members. Similar to the first panel, each presenter will have 5 minutes to talk. And as you're listening, you will hear how the professional precarities are multi-layered, and you're also going to gain some insights on how the fragility of the early childhood system or systems are increasingly pronounced. And just one last thing to point out, and this was mentioned in the first panel as well. The truth of the matter is that the issues that we'll hear about are all pervasive. The women who you're going to hear from have spent years advocating for children and family, for the early childhood profession, and for the members of their communities. I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that although this panel is specifically focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, we do have to recognize that we are battling many different pandemics, including the pandemic of racism. And I just wanted to bring in a provocation from a report published by the Foundation for Children's Development. This was published soon after the murder of George Floyd, and it was titled, "We Demand Justice for Early Childhood Educators." This is specific to the US context, but I think there are, as we know, and as people have mentioned, there are many parallels to what's happening in other transnational contexts. And in that report, they write, "The current status of the ECE workforce includes unlivable wages and benefits, disrespect and failure to be recognized as professionals, inadequate access to high quality educator preparation, and a dearth of meaningful ongoing professional learning. These realities are rooted in institutional racism, which denies access, compensation, and professional advancement." And with that, I'm going to pass the mic to our first presenter, Brooke Richardson. I'm gonna also allow the presenters to introduce themselves. I have a link to a document that shares their full bios, so if you would like to hear more about them, please read that document. And then I'm also gonna be including links to the different organizations they represent, so you can also look through those to learn more about their ongoing work and advocacy. And just one last thing to point out, and also to my presenters, I don't want to take a break in between each of your talking points. And so Brooke, once you're done, Huli, if you will just pick up the mic, and then so on and so forth, that would be appreciated. And I'll also, though, for everyone else, provide the order of the presenters so you know who to expect as we move forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lacey, and thank you so much for having me here today. I do want to just take one moment to acknowledge the land that I'm working, the colonial lands that are known as Toronto, Ontario, Canada. These lands are the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and are now home to many diverse First Nations and Métis people. So I'm very grateful to be working on this land I'm working with and to be here with you today. So when I got this invitation to sit on this panel, it was kind of a little bit of a question of why me? And, you know, after reflecting on this question, I think the why me, and hopefully I've got this right, maybe I'm totally all wrong, but I think the why me is largely to the work that I've been doing with the Association of Early Childhood Educators of Ontario prior to and then throughout the pandemic. And this presentation kind of flows really nicely from what Marcy was talking about and how we need to have stronger organizing. And what I want to share with you today is just an example of that resistance in action. So a little bit more about maybe a hopeful story, because we are all so familiar with the poor working conditions, wages, racialization of the workforce. So the AECEO is an organization, we actually just had our 70th anniversary. So we've been around for a while. And I didn't say my role in that is the president of the board of directors. And we currently, we exist alongside a professional, a regulatory college. So since the establishment of the regulatory college, our mandate has really shifted to become one of uniting ECEs, of trying to further decent work for the profession and professional recognition and respect of early childhood educators. And the way that we do that is to try and build, like Marcy was saying, we don't have, I mean, there are some ECEs and unions, but even the ECEs and unions tend to be in different unions. in our jurisdiction. So it's about recognizing we have to build the infrastructure so that we're able to organize and respond, because governments have often, sadly, have an interest in kind of divide and conquer, right? If we can get infighting, then we don't have to deal with the issues they're fighting amongst themselves. So in our sector, we really need to band together to have a strong, clear, united message. And I do want to say, the pandemic has been, obviously, as Matthias said, unprecedented in so many ways. Prior to the pandemic, we already felt like we were scrambling to keep all the balls in the air and get all these things going. But we've had amazing leadership, and I have to give a shout out to Alana Powell and Carolyn Ferns from the Ontario Coalition. And these two organizations, led by these two incredibly inspiring women, have been the rocks that have held us together. And there's been many other people as well. But in conversation with Alana, and I was saying, what's unique about us? What works? And as we were talking, we kind of realized, what works about the AECO is we really have these two arms integrated. So we have this academic kind of research side. So on the board of directors, we've got academics, and Alana herself has an academic background. And then we've got the community organizing, and that's the part, in bringing these two things together is always a challenge, because they kind of operate in two parallel, separate worlds. But what we've really tried to do, and I think Dr. Rachel Langford has been a huge inspiration here, is try to bring these worlds together and do some concrete things, building bridges between them. And so at the ACEO, we were fortunate in that heading into the pandemic, we already had some infrastructure in place in terms of community organizing. So one of the main mechanisms we have were what we call communities of practice, which are they're given a small stipend of funds to bring ECEs in various geographical communities together to talk about issues, to talk about pedagogical issues or policy things or resist policy moves. And so that when the pandemic hit, we already had these groups established, and we had the structure there to be able to respond in a way that was cohesive and that was organized. And I think that was the key for us. The other thing we had in place was that we had good relationships with key allied organizations. So those unions, foundations, research bodies, other academics, we were able to draw on all those resources. And we also made an explicit effort to work positively with government. Now, not to say the government liked us or listened to us at all, but we did make an explicit effort to stay at the table with them. And it became harder to ignore us. So we were, Carolyn and Alana did amazing work creating a report that came up with 27 concrete, here's what we need to do in reopening childcare. And we presented that to government, and we had big tent meetings where different stakeholders all came together. And so no matter where the government went to get feedback, they were getting that same sort of message. And then when they acted in a way that was not consistent with that message, we were able to have a lever to stand on to push back, which is what kind of we're in the process of doing now. And yeah, so I guess the only other thing I was going to say is, have we had any policy outcome success? I think in terms of what emergency childcare looked like, I think we were able to have more of an influence. But in terms of the broader sector issues, I mean, long-term care has also been a huge issue in our region, and the corporate for-profit mindset has been questioned, in a very big and public way, and is continuing to be so. So yes, we do kind of have this opportunity in political consciousness and public consciousness to be like, hey, this doesn't work. And so that's what we're working with now, is how can we use this, what could be this moment, to make some fundamental, maybe not even make those fundamental changes, but make people aware that there's another way. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Brock. My name is Juliana Pendu Mckeen. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I was the co-founder and director of Honeybirds Play School in New York City. Honeybirds was a Waldorf certified program, a teeny tiny school. Unfortunately, Honeybirds was forced to close this summer because of the repercussions of COVID. I'm also a founding member of the Brooklyn Coalition of Early Childhood Programs and a member of the Empire State Campaign for Childcare here in New York. Additionally, I'm finishing a Master of Social Work at Columbia University. And I really want to talk to you all about the type of advocacy that we have been engaged in here in Brooklyn specifically. COVID has really forced early ed programs to come together. We created the Brooklyn Coalition of Early Childhood Programs in March, and it started as a group of 15 directors that more or less knew each other loosely over the years. And, you know, we came together actually before the big shutdown happened, kind of looking at it looming in the near distance. And then over the spring and the summer, we've actually grown to over 115 groups. So I can't remember who talked about unionizing earlier, but it's something that's come together kind of in that same vein. You know, we need to be able to come together to really represent our profession. So the coalition was really born out of a need. And once the groundwork was laid, it was clear that we had all been looking for this type of group. Before the pandemic, the systems governing early ed to a lesser extent financing childcare in the US weren't working. The relationship with our licensing agencies is not one of partnership here. I don't know if you all feel the same way everywhere that you are. But even though we all have the same goals, we're not partners. We don't work well together, even though we should be able to. We should be able to rely on our licensing agencies for support, but instead we are heavily policed by them. The standard that they hold us to is not the same standard that they hold themselves to. So when the pandemic hit, this relationship did not improve. If anything, it made it more difficult. Here in New York, we received zero guidance on how to operate, how to close, when to close, how to reopen. I think the first we heard from them was maybe mid to late June. There were months of silence, and even after repeated requests for guidance, we kept reaching out, and they were like, we don't have anything for you. As a result, the coalition created guidance and protocols that we were able to share amongst ourselves and any other program that needed support. We were able to share a uniform response with all of the families enrolled in coalition programs, and this work continues today. Within the coalition, we've also engaged in advocacy at the local level, the state level, and we're trying to push into the federal level. We've hosted COVID-safe rallies over the past few months. We've printed postcards for children to color and mailed to elected officials. We have even left love notes at the Department of Health's door. We've asked families enrolled in our programs to write and call elected officials, and we've been able to speak to city council representatives and state level politicians. We know that we're getting things done. We know that we're causing waves because the Department of Health is particularly grouchy when we bring things up and when our coalition name comes up. We're causing good trouble because the system clearly doesn't work well. We kept looking for an invite to the table, like Brooke was mentioning, but we had to bring our own folding chair, a la Shirley Chisholm. Something we have to keep in mind is that in theory, our programs represent a vast number of families, but the way that our system is set up, it's super privatized. So parents pay for our services. So they're often confused as to why we're asking them to engage in advocacy efforts, because they're like, I already pay for the service. Why do I need to help some more? But the pandemic has been a really good opportunity to shed light on how broken the childcare system has been in the US. Folks have been ringing the alarm for decades, but I think that now many more people are aware of its current status. It has been somewhat of a hurdle to engage parents in advocacy efforts. There's a lot of work to be done on all levels, and I think that parents experience a level of burnout after a while. And to directors and administrators, all advocacy efforts feel important, but parents don't have the bandwidth to participate in all of them. So something for us to think about is, how do we choose which efforts to ask for support with? One big thing that the coalition is working on right now is we are pushing for the disbursement and better management of federal funds allocated for childcare that have been mismanaged by New York State. Our governor received these funds back in April, but didn't begin dispersing these funds until late August. And so many programs suffered and closed in the interim. We still don't know where these funds ended up because so many few programs have received meager grants. We're also hosting, on a more positive note, a series of support groups for educators, because those who care for our children also need care. So our work continues. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou katoa, nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. So my name is Lynn Wright, and this is my colleague, Karen. Kia ora. Karen Hollis. We're going to share this spot. I'm going to talk first, and then Karen's going to speak. So I am a senior teacher with He Whānau Manaaki o Tararua Free Kindergarten Association. That's in Wellington, New Zealand. So Whānau Manaaki o Tararua translates from Māori as the caring family of Tararua. So it's upholding the values of the kindergarten movement and acknowledging the Tararua Mountains that define the lower North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So that's really where we are positioned in the lower part of the North Island, but we are part of 25 other kindergarten associations across New Zealand that are based in every town city in New Zealand. So Whānau Manaaki is a community-based early childhood education organisation. We've got 5,000 children, employing 900 teachers and support staff, 100% qualified teaching staff, and we operate 102 kindergartens, 2 home-based, Pacific home-based networks, and also manage government-funded family support programs. So what I'm trying is to give you a kind of a sense of the size of the organisation, because really what I want to talk about is Whānau Manaaki was able to quickly respond to the COVID pandemic, and so we're providing community outreach, but also pedagogical information. So innovation, sorry. So really keeping connected was one of our main priorities. And when I was listening to Mary talking before, she talked about the importance of Māori's very sophisticated and relational responses to trauma, and that really is a framework for the ways that we've, as an organisation, approach the work that we are doing from a relational context. So the framing of our response is really epitomised in a whakataki that is nā tō roru, nā taku roru, ka ora ai te iwi. And that means with your food, translated as with your food basket and my food basket, the people will thrive. So the message was, we're in this together, we all need to work together. One of the first things that happened in New Zealand when we went into level 4 lockdown was that we changed the language from lockdown to rahui, which is it's a Māori term that talks about a ban or restriction temporarily in place. So rather than a focus inwardly on looking after your own self, it was a message around we're all in this together. So it was just a shift in a way of thinking about what was happening. The other thing that is quite significant from the Whānau Manaaki's perspective is that we're driven and guided by our early childhood curriculum document Te Whāriki, and so those principles that drive or underpin Te Whāriki also underpin the approach that we have and the way that we responded to the pandemic. So one of the key principles in Te Whāriki is that relationships underpin learning. And so that idea that you cannot, you can't leave the people, you can't ignore the people or the relationships when you're thinking about how you are responding and connecting. So moving on, so the reasons, so I think the first point I wanted to make is that actually our curriculum document gives us a strong foundation, and the direction we were coming from was about people connecting. And the reasons that we were able to step into our role so readily is because of the relationships that we already have with our families, with our colleagues, but also with our various government agencies. So our reputation and our culture as an organisation meant that we could access the various strands that we have to be able to make things happen. The families trust us to support them, community and government agencies trust us to be competent and sensitive in delivering support, and staff and are flexible and supportive of our organisation's kaupapa, and so are keen to be able to do what they can to help. So I'm going to just I'm just going to pass this on to Karen. Karen is a teacher in one of the kindergartens that was particularly affected by some of the struggles that occurred in the pandemic, and she's going to talk about how it was for her as a teacher.
Kia ora, I'm Karen Hollis and I'm a teacher at Strathmore Park Kindergarten. Our kindergarten is made up of many different cultures, and we have a wide range of families, also refugee families. So there are things in place like languages, social struggles with our families. And as a teacher, full stop, but especially in these communities, we also take on a role as a social worker. That was a huge big thing during the rahui, the lockdown. And it was a time of great change, not only for us, but for our families as well, for our community. We're a very strong community, and the community often looks to the teachers for guidance, especially when they don't have the language themselves, or they don't have access to other agencies. So we act as that go-between for them. And we had to adjust in lots of different ways in the way that we live day to day. And this was reflected too in the way that we connected with our community during this time. And we used many different avenues, and we did basic things like phone calls every day to check in on our families, to make sure they were doing okay, what they needed from us, what we could get. And we also had the support of our association, our senior teachers, where we could get straight in touch with them and say, look, we've got this family that needs this. But as soon as we went into this lockdown, the association got in touch with us too and said, right, what do you need? What do your families need? And that made a huge difference. And it was things like vouchers, food vouchers. It was things like, as a team, a teaching team, we got together and we made up resource packs, because even though the government had said, yes, these will be going out, we wanted our families to have these sorts of things in place straight away to give them a sense of security, but also to know that they weren't alone, that we were all in this together, that we would be helping them. Certainly as a teacher, there were times of uncertainty for ourselves personally, and it didn't go without feeling a bit anxious sometimes, because you're doing that role of a teacher, but you've also got your own family and your own things to do. And that was where communication and connection with each other was so important. And also, once again, having that that connection with our senior teachers and with our association. Our association was wonderful in directing us and guiding us on what we could do and what they could offer, and that made a huge difference for us. Senior teachers phoned the teachers and asked us how we were going. Is there anything that we can do? And it was when we were open for families to come in, it was also, as a teacher, do you feel okay coming in? Are you okay to come in and be with the children, or would you rather do the support online? So we would do things like with Facebook pages, story parks. We had avenues that we could continue to offer the day-to-day for the children, so that they could see us and have that, you know, those people that they see every day and talking. Zoom meetings, like other people have said, it was all of a sudden, I know for myself, it was, I had never done a Zoom meeting. I didn't know what that was. You know, I knew what it was, but I had never done one. So it was like, whoa. Luckily, I also have a husband who is a teacher and a son who is a teacher. So the three of us in our house, we had teaching stations, and I could call on them for help and guidance in terms of logistics of providing online teaching for children, and also for parents. You know, we got a lot of feedback through that, and we would work with them on, they would see us do things online, and then they would come back to us and say that was great. They would extend on it often, and they would come back and give us ideas of what we could offer for the children, and that was wonderful. So we kept that connection going with that, and we also kept connection going with families that had left us. But because we have things like a Facebook page and they were part of that, we had families coming back to us, connecting through that. So that was really important, and it made a huge difference when we actually went right back into the kindergartens and the families and the children came back in, because they had continued to see us and to hear us. We continued to have those relationships going, having those connections with everybody. As we continue to move through this journey, there's been a consistent and clear message between ourselves, from our association, from our government, that we're all in this together. Let's look after each other and let's be kind. And amongst the uncertainty of these times, the connections have become more personal and more real. And being a teacher, I actually feel valued as a teacher. I don't feel that I'm being seen as a childminder. And I think that has strengthened over this time. And I definitely working in partnership with families, colleagues, other agencies, and our government. We continue on this journey, and there are things that we've put in place in our kindergarten in terms of continuing to help our families. For instance, we've came back, and a big thing with our families was food, basic things like food, having food. And that's where our association stepped in, and they provided families with vouchers for supermarkets and things like that. So when we came back, it was like, well, our families still need this, because a lot of them have lost their income, part of their income, or they've lost family members during this time. So as a teaching team, we came up with a Pataka Kai, which is a community pantry, I suppose you could say, which is in our grounds. And we have a saying that you take what you want and you give what you can. And we have food in there that families can access, and it's done in a sensitive way that they can just go in there and they can just help themselves. And the feedback we get from that has been amazing. So I think it's actually brought our community, our strong community, even closer together. And it's a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to share the experience of the Danish ECE teachers as seen from the union. My name is Rikke Wettendorf. I am a senior advisor at the Danish Union for ECE teachers, and we organize almost all of the teachers in Denmark. We currently have 61,000 members. In Denmark, more than 90% of all 0 to 6-year-olds attend daycare. Daycare is considered a pillar of the welfare society because it allows parents to work and thereby generate the taxes needed for the services that the state provides. This means that the Danish ECE teachers have been considered or are considered essential staff during the pandemic. And that really puts us in quite a favorable position as a union to collaborate with the government regarding the COVID-19 response. But even though our ministry, or the ministry responsible for the ECEC centers, very much listens to what we have to say about the teachers' conditions, the teachers are beginning to feel really worn down by the pandemic. The restrictions that were put into place after the initial lockdown in March have now become the new normal, and they are affecting the daily lives of the centers to a large extent. For instance, the children are organized into smaller groups, which are not really supposed to mix with other groups. So the children are supposed to stay in the smaller group that they're put into for the entire day. Adult-led activities take up a much larger chunk of the day than it used to before the pandemic. Children are encouraged not to hug. Nobody expects the children to keep the social distance in the same way as the grown-ups, but still we have examples of children being encouraged to keep a distance to their playmates. As a rule of thumb, you cannot invite people outside of your immediate circle to your birthday if you're a child. So no more asking your friends from kindergarten over. Playdates are to be kept at a minimum. And in many centers, many of the toys have been put away for hygienic reasons, simply because they're not, they can't be cleaned in the correct way. So while the children are kept safe, seen from a health perspective, our members worry about the social and psychological long-term effects of the children due to these restrictions. And the teachers feel that they cannot be the teachers they want to be. And that causes a considerable amount of stress in them. So while we, of course, as a union advocate for the health and safety of the teachers, we also advocate for the children, because in doing so, we also advocate for the teachers. This means that we continuously ask the Ministry of Education and Children to help us translate or interpret the guidelines from the health authorities. We simply ask them, how do we translate this into our daily practice? What does this mean for us? And this means that it has now been established by the ministry that the professional judgment of the teacher, excuse me, that's my dog being really impatient. That's it, still. Sorry. This means that it has now been established by the ministry that the professional judgment of the teacher of the individual need of the children has to take precedent over the health guidelines. We have had examples of children hiding in the playground, simply hiding from the teachers so that they could play with their best friend who had been put into a different group for the day. So we brought this to the ministry and they said, no, you're not supposed to separate friends. So professional judgment is put above the health guidelines. We have also advocated for the postponement of certain documentation requirements and certain projects that have been started in different centers, and we are gaining traction with the ministry, and we expect that an announcement would be made really soon that the requirements in the Daycare Act about evaluating the work with the daycare curriculum will be postponed from New Year to the end of March. Finally, I must add that we do not do all of this work alone. We collaborate closely with the other organizations, especially the parents' organization and the Danish municipalities who own run most of the centers in Denmark. Even though we represent different groups and have different interests, we make an effort to find a common ground so that we can all get through this pandemic in the best way possible. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's a wonderful discussion today. So the next thing that we're going to do is join small breakout groups to have a more extensive discussion with our peers and colleagues. The groups will be about 12 people in each group, so it's a nice opportunity to greet your friends and see people you've never met before. You're welcome to keep your camera off if you weren't expecting to be on the spot today. That's fine, no problem. And then we'll come back together after about 15 minutes to wrap up and talk about what's coming next for RECE. I do want to send everyone the information that we'll be discussing today. So here is a document where you can find some prompts to work on with your groups. You'll just go around and introduce yourselves, say where you're located, and then address the 2 questions there. We've had some wonderful volunteers who've offered to be note takers for each group. So you'll see that they will have a link to a Google document where they'll record some of what was discussed. And the goal of that is to take this beyond this conversation. This has been such a beautiful conversation with all of our panelists, and we'd like to see it move forward because 15 minutes is definitely going to feel too fast and we'll want to keep conversing. So if everyone's able to access those questions, then we are good to go and we will go into our breakout rooms. If you need to leave, we know it's late, thank you, but take a look at that document because you can still share your thoughts in a Qualtrics survey if that's easier. So that's there for you if you want to contribute some thoughts. All right, so with that, we will go into our breakout rooms and we'll come back together just a few minutes before the end to wrap up.
I wanted to thank everybody for being here, and I wanted to also, I want to say a couple things, but also I want to start out by thanking the RECE Steering Committee, the Arizona State University, especially Jana Goebel, who is here, and Bank Street College of Education with Mark Nagasawa for organizing the technology, the Eventbrite program and the invitations and much more. And thank you to all the members of the organizing committee, including Mark Tesar, Mark Nagasawa, and Lacey Peters for organizing the different panels. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you today, but on such a very important topic. And we don't have enough time for everything, but I think that we learned a few things. I wasn't depressed, I was impressed with the conversation. I think perhaps one of the questions is how could we work best in collaboration? And one point that I had was to continue to learn. RECE has always privileged international and cross-cultural information when we could do it, and today was no exception. And I just wanted to say that hearing from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Denmark, the activist presentations and everything was extremely interesting. So first and foremost, I have been an advocate and I will remain an advocate that we might be able to work together to support each other in different country contexts and share information at the very least, and possibly advocate for each other and with each other in the future. So that is certainly something I've heard, but also something that I wanted to put out there. I want to make sure that I focus on some of the things that I heard that were really important. At the negative side, Matthias talked a lot about the world. Well, he mentioned the World Bank, but many other people talked about the highlighting of, I think, private programs, sometimes in trying to keep them open, if possible, or highlighting privatization over public or universal support. It's something we need to watch out for. On a more positive, or on a different side, everybody was talking about the essential nature of childcare across all the countries, I think, and the fact that in Denmark, for example, that they think that keeping people at work produces taxes and therefore childcare is important was an equation I can't duplicate, but I think it's something to remember. The essential but expendable, or essential and not expendable equation. And then finally, the differences between the treatment and wages and so forth of school versus education, early education. But last but not least, I wanted to emphasize the importance of the activism that I heard, the resilience and resistance movements, the partnerships that are newly being formed that seem to be emerging with families and professional educators, and that I think those partnerships are going to be part of our growing, hope, and the way in which we can see the sector as resilient and staying together, because parents need us, we need parents. Children have multiple homes that they are working in. And I'm going to stop because Beth is going to say a few more better remarks, I'm sure. But I want everybody to remember that we are at receinternational.org, and the transcripts and the videotape will be there, and also a blog, and also that there's a Facebook post, RECE, parentheses, Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education, for those who aren't on it. Beth?
I think I almost get to say goodbye to everyone, but it was great to see you. We emphasize and have a long, long history of emphasizing issues framed in social justice and anti-oppressive work. And this is the first of several planned webinars. The next one will be more or less a RECE business meeting, a virtual one, and that will be in early January. We have exciting news. The website is getting entirely redone. That launch will be next month, and I've been putting the website in the chat throughout the meeting, but please check us out. And we will be looking at other themes. If you would like to be part of planning another webinar, have input about this one, please email me directly, and I will convey that back to the steering committee meeting. But thank you so much. Asante sana, merci, karibuni, kwaherini, bye-bye.